Welcome to Hidden Chapters. Nothing failed here. That was the failure. Let's begin. They didn't call me in to translate words. They called me in to translate responsibility away. And the one name they wanted removed from the record was already on Interpol's radar. That's when I understood, if I spoke clearly, my life wouldn't stay local. They reached out through a channel that only gets used when someone wants a favor to feel like an order. No paperwork. No official request. Just a message that said they needed language support for an incident outside the usual chain. I'd done joint work long enough to recognize the tone. It wasn't urgent because of danger. It was urgent because of exposure. The location was a municipal building near the edge of a mountain town, concrete, fluorescent lights, the smell of old coffee and fresh panic. 2 local officers waited at the entrance with polite faces and tight shoulders. They shook my hand like they were grateful, but their eyes kept checking the hallway behind me. Inside, a small group of civilians sat in plastic chairs. Quiet. Exhausted. The kind of silence you get when people don't know which version of their own story will be allowed to exist. A woman held her phone in both hands like it was the only stable object in the room. A teenage boy stared at the floor and blinked too slowly. A senior official introduced himself and spoke in careful English, the kind built from training slides and rehearsed confidence. "We just need you to ensure clarity," he said. "Some statements are in mixed dialect. We can't afford misunderstandings." Clarity. That word again. They led me to a side office where a recorder was already running. On the desk were printed transcripts with sections highlighted in yellow. Next to them, a blank report template with official logos waiting to be filled in. Then he did something that turned the room colder. He slid a folder across the desk and left his fingers resting on it, as if keeping it from moving too far into my reach. "Before you begin," he said, "we need alignment." I opened the folder. At the top of the first page was a reference number I recognized even without context, an international format, the kind you don't see in local incidents. Below it, a name partially redacted. The letters that remained were enough. I didn't react. Training held my face still. But my mind sharpened instantly, like a blade pulled free. Interpol. I looked up, slowly. "This is not local," I said. He nodded once, like acknowledging weather. "We don't want it to become international," he replied. "That's why you're here." Then he pointed at the transcript. "There are phrases you must not translate directly," he said. "Certain words cause escalation. You will choose alternatives. You understand." It wasn't a request. It was a test, measured, quiet, and aimed at the part of me that still believed language was neutral. I glanced back at the folder. One of the pages listed aliases. Patterns. Countries. Theft operations so clean they looked like magic until you realized someone had written the trick in advance. One of the most wanted thieves in the world. And someone here was trying to keep his name out of the record with a translator's pen. I thought of my wife at home. Not in danger, yet. But close enough to my life that any pressure on me could become pressure on her without anyone needing to say it aloud. The official leaned forward. "We need you to make this clean," he said. And in that moment, I understood the real assignment. They weren't asking me to translate a statement. They were asking me to decide what would become real. I didn't answer right away. Silence is useful in rooms like that. It makes people reveal how badly they need you. The official didn't repeat himself. He just kept his hand resting lightly on the folder, as if proximity alone reinforced authority. I glanced again at the transcripts. Highlighted sections everywhere. Entire sentences marked with notes in the margins: simplify, remove tone, avoid implication. One paragraph had a line drawn straight through it, replaced with a cleaner version already typed beneath. It wasn't translation work. It was editing reality. What exactly escalates? I asked. He smiled slightly, relieved I'd chosen a practical question. Names. Certainty. Specific verbs, he said. If a witness says, he stole, you translate, property went missing. If they say a name, you confirm identity isn't established. Small adjustments. Professional. Professional. I'd heard that word used to justify worse. The first civilian came in, a shop owner, mid-40s, still wearing the same jacket he probably had on when whatever happened actually happened. He spoke quickly, voice tight but controlled. A mix of dialects, some slang, some formal phrasing. Nothing I couldn't render cleanly. Except he kept repeating one name. The name from the folder. I translated accurately at first. Habit. Training. Respect for the speaker. The official behind me didn't interrupt. He just made small marks on a notepad, each stroke deliberate. When the shop owner left, the official stepped forward. Too direct, he said. You're attaching certainty where ambiguity protects everyone. Protects who? I asked. He didn't answer that. Instead, he slid a revised version across the desk. My translation, softened. The name replaced with an unidentified individual. The theft reframed as possible misplacement during confusion. It read smoothly. It also read false. The next witness, a teenager, described vehicles outside the building late at night. Dark vans. No markings. Men speaking quietly, professionally. He'd heard one of them use the same name again. I translated that too. And again, the official made notes. By the third witness, the pattern was obvious. They didn't want my linguistic skill. They wanted my credibility. A translator's neutrality carries weight. If I softened the record, it would feel legitimate. That's when my phone buzzed. A message from my wife. Nothing dramatic. Just, everything okay? Saw some unfamiliar cars near the building earlier. Asterisk. My chest tightened. Not a threat. Not even confirmation. Just presence. I looked back at the official. You said this stays local, I said quietly. It will, he replied. If the record stays clean. The folder on the desk felt heavier now. Interpol reference number. Alias list. Cross-border theft patterns. A man who'd built a reputation on moving through systems faster than they could agree he existed. And someone here was trying to slow that recognition down with language. I resumed the session. This time, I chose my words more carefully, not softer, not harder. Precise. Enough clarity that meaning survived, but not enough confrontation to shut the process down immediately. It was a balancing act. Truth doesn't always vanish in a single cut. Sometimes it fades through gradual correction. As the last civilian left, the official studied the transcript. You're close, he said. But still too exact. I closed the folder gently. That's the job, I replied. He watched me for a long moment, then gave a small nod that wasn't approval. It was acknowledgement. Because both of us understood something now. If I kept translating honestly, this incident wouldn't stay local. And if it went international? The most wanted thief in the world wouldn't be the only person whose life got complicated. The next morning, the building felt different. Same fluorescent lights. Same coffee smell. Same plastic chairs. But the tension had shifted from uncertainty to management. People weren't trying to understand what happened anymore. They were trying to decide how it would be remembered. That's a more dangerous phase. Because once memory becomes negotiable, facts stop being the priority. The official greeted me with the same measured politeness, but this time there was another person in the room. Quiet. Civilian clothes. No introduction offered. He didn't speak, didn't write, didn't even check his phone. He just listened. That told me the story had already grown beyond local jurisdiction. We resumed translation. New statements. New civilians. Some calmer, some more cautious. Word had spread that what they said might not stay exactly as spoken. That changes tone fast. People begin editing themselves before anyone else has to. I translated faithfully again. Not aggressively. Not confrontationally. Just accurately. Enough that any external review would see consistency. Enough that ambiguity couldn't fully erase the name in the folder. Halfway through the session, the silent observer finally spoke. "Do you always translate this directly?" he asked. His accent was neutral by design. Professional neutrality. The kind used in multinational briefings where identity is intentionally blurred. "Yes," I said. He nodded once. No embellishment. No mitigation. "Correct." The official shifted slightly beside him. Not nervous. Calculating. After the civilians left, they asked me to stay. The observer closed the door himself. Small gesture. Significant. "We understand you have family here," he said casually. Not a question. Not a threat either. Just information placed carefully between us. "My wife lives here," I said evenly. "Yes," he replied. "And she appreciates stability." That was the first real pressure point. Still indirect. Still deniable. But enough to confirm what my wife had noticed wasn't coincidence. Presence had been established. I thought about the man in the folder. One of the most wanted thieves globally. Interpol alert spanning years. Financial theft, information extraction, logistical manipulation. A professional who understood systems well enough to bend them without obvious force. And now, somehow, his name was orbiting this small mountain town. "You realize," the observer continued, "that translation shapes escalation. A precise word can trigger international interest unnecessarily." "Or appropriately," I said. He didn't disagree. He didn't agree either. That silence carried weight. They weren't denying the man's identity anymore. They were managing timing. Trying to keep Interpol from stepping fully into a situation that local authorities preferred to control quietly. Control keeps narratives tidy. International involvement rarely does. When I left the building that afternoon, I noticed the cars my wife mentioned. Parked legally. Occupied intermittently. Nothing overt. Just enough consistency to suggest observation rather than coincidence. At home, she didn't ask many questions. She didn't need to. "You're translating something sensitive," she said simply. "Yes. And accuracy matters. More than usual." She nodded. No drama. No fear. Just understanding. That's what long military-adjacent lives do to people. They learn when presence is information rather than danger. That night, I reviewed the transcripts again. Line by line. Every word I'd chosen had a consequence. Too soft, and the thief remained local noise. Too sharp, and the situation could escalate faster than anyone here wanted. Including the people watching my building. For the first time, I understood the real tension. It wasn't about catching the thief. It was about deciding who controlled the story long enough to decide what catching him would actually mean. By the fourth day, the transcript started coming pre-edited. Not overtly. Subtle adjustments. Words already softened before they reached me. Names replaced with initials. Active verbs converted into passive constructions that made responsibility dissolve without anyone noticing. "He stole equipment" became equipment was no longer present. "I saw him near the storage area" became an unidentified individual was nearby. Language can erase faster than fire. The official presented the revised documents as efficiency. Fewer corrections later. Less confusion. Cleaner reporting lines. He spoke the way professionals do when they believe procedure itself should end the conversation. I read them slowly. Then I asked for the original audio. That request changed the room. Not dramatically. No raised voices. Just a pause long enough to acknowledge friction. The silent observer from the previous day wasn't present, but his absence felt deliberate. Someone else had stepped into the process without stepping into the room. "We've summarized accurately," the official said. "I still need the audio." Professional tone. No accusation. Just procedure. It's hard to refuse procedure without admitting motive. Eventually, they provided it. The difference was immediate. Witnesses sounded more certain than the transcripts suggested. Names were spoken clearly. Descriptions sharper. One man explicitly referenced seeing a photograph circulating online, an Interpol advisory image that matched the partially redacted file I'd seen. That line had vanished completely in the written version. Not softened. Removed. I translated the audio faithfully and attached both versions side by side. No commentary. Just contrast. Let the language demonstrate its own distortion. That afternoon, the observer returned. This time he introduced himself only as coordination. No agency. No country. Neutral by design. He reviewed the paired transcripts quietly. "You understand what this does," he said. "It preserves accuracy. It accelerates escalation. Possibly." He closed the folder. "And your family?" There it was again. Not a threat. Not reassurance. Just context placed carefully beside a decision. "My wife prefers clarity," I said. He studied me longer this time. Then he surprised me. "So do we," he said softly. That wasn't what the official beside him expected. I saw it in the subtle shift of posture, the recalculation. Because clarity invites external attention. And external attention invites Interpol, media, oversight, things that complicate quiet resolutions. When they left, the official lingered. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said. "Or as big as it already is." He didn't argue. He didn't have to. The next morning, 2 additional vehicles appeared near my building. Same pattern. Legal parking. Rotating occupants. Observation without confrontation. My wife noticed immediately. "They're not hiding anymore," she said over breakfast. "No. You still translating accurately?" "Yes." She nodded. "Then they're just keeping track. No fear. No panic. Just assessment. Years around operations teach you to differentiate between surveillance and intent. Still, presence carries weight even when it stays polite." Later that day, an encrypted message arrived through a channel I hadn't used in years. Short. Official. Interpol liaison requesting access to original translations. No intermediaries. No local filtering. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Because once information crosses that boundary, it rarely returns smaller. And the people who preferred a clean local narrative would know exactly who let it cross. I didn't answer the Interpol message immediately. Not because I didn't know what I'd do, but because timing matters when information starts crossing borders. Send too quickly, and it looks impulsive. Wait too long, and someone else might rewrite the record before it travels. So I reviewed everything again. Audio files. Written transcripts. The softened versions. The removed sections. The patterns in language that suggested intentional delay rather than simple caution. Once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Words weren't being corrected for clarity. They were being managed for jurisdiction. The official called mid-afternoon. Calm voice. Professional tone. The kind you use when you hope control still exists. We understand external interest has increased, he said. Before anything is shared internationally, we'd appreciate coordination. Coordination. Another neutral word doing heavy lifting. You mean approval, I said. A pause. We mean stability. Stability often means containment. I didn't commit either way. Just acknowledged the conversation and ended it without offering reassurance. Reassurance becomes leverage quickly once systems start adjusting. That evening, the observer reappeared outside my building. Not hiding. Leaning casually against a car, like someone waiting for a friend. When I approached, he nodded once. No pressure, he said. Just context. I assumed. You're not the only one translating this situation. That was new. Meaning multiple narratives were already forming. Local authorities. International agencies. Media speculation. Each version competing for legitimacy before facts fully settled. And your version? I asked. Accurate enough to act, he replied. Not loud enough to destabilize. A careful balance. Then he added something unexpected. The man you're documenting, he thrives on jurisdiction gaps. If he stays local, he stays invisible internationally. That's the incentive. That aligned with what I already knew. The most wanted thieves don't just steal assets. They steal time. Delay recognition long enough, and pursuit fragments. I thought about my wife upstairs. About the cars that appeared and disappeared predictably. About how indirect pressure works best when it never becomes explicit. You're saying accuracy helps everyone, I said. I'm saying clarity reduces his advantage. Not quite endorsement. Not quite warning. Just information placed where it could influence without ordering. Later that night, my wife asked the only question that mattered. Are you going to send it? Yes. Then do it cleanly. Cleanly. That word again. Different meaning now. Not sanitized. Not softened. Just precise. Transparent. Difficult to reinterpret. I packaged the original audio, my direct translations, and the comparative transcripts. No commentary. No accusations. Just documentation. Before sending, I hesitated once. Not fear. Not doubt. Awareness. Once this crossed into Interpol's system, local containment would end. Surveillance around my building might change tone. Conversations would shift. Some people would appreciate clarity. Others would consider it unnecessary exposure. I pressed send. No dramatic confirmation followed. Just a secure acknowledgement that the files were received. Within hours, the atmosphere shifted. The cars outside didn't disappear. But they stopped rotating. Presence became steady. Less about watching. More about reminding. And inside the translation center the next morning, the official greeted me with the same politeness, but without the earlier assumption that language could keep this incident comfortably small. Because once information moves internationally, it stops belonging to the people who preferred silence. And that meant the most wanted thief in the world had just lost the one advantage he relied on most. Ambiguity. Nothing dramatic happened after I sent the files. No calls in the night. No direct warnings. No sudden disappearance of the cars outside my building. That's how you know something actually moved. Real system shifts rarely announce themselves loudly. They show up in small adjustments, tone changes, scheduling differences, people who suddenly listen more carefully than before. At the translation center, the atmosphere had cooled. Not hostile. Not welcoming either. Professional distance replaced earlier attempts at persuasion. The official who had pushed for cleaner language no longer suggested alternatives. He simply handed over material and waited. Which told me Interpol had already confirmed receipt. And local authorities understood the narrative was no longer fully theirs. The observer appeared less frequently now, but when he did, the conversations were shorter. Less philosophical. More operational. External coordination has begun, he said once. No details. No names. Just acknowledgement that the situation had crossed an invisible threshold. I kept translating. Accurately. Consistently. Predictably. That consistency matters. Once someone decides to trust your wording, deviation raises suspicion. Accuracy, repeated calmly, becomes its own defense. But the subtle pressures shifted toward my family instead. Nothing overt. My wife's commute took longer because minor road checks appeared unpredictably. A relative's workplace received an unexpected, routine audit. Packages arrived opened but resealed carefully enough to maintain deniability. Presence again. Context. Reminders that decisions ripple outward. We talked about it quietly at home. You expected this, she said. Yes. And you'd do it again? Yes. She nodded. No drama. Just the steady acceptance that comes from living near systems that rarely explain themselves fully. Meanwhile, the translations themselves began reflecting broader awareness. Witnesses mentioned hearing international names spoken openly now. Someone described seeing a printed advisory image that matched the Interpol file more clearly than before. Another civilian reported a sudden absence of the individuals who'd been quietly coordinating things days earlier. Movement without spectacle. Exactly how professionals disengage when attention grows. Then one afternoon, a new request arrived. Not from local authorities. Interpol directly. They wanted clarification on one specific line in an early transcript, the moment a witness described a vehicle convoy leaving before dawn. The original softened version had called it transport activity. My translation had restored the more precise phrasing, coordinated departure. That distinction mattered operationally. It suggested planning, not improvisation. I provided context. Linguistic nuance. Cultural cues. Nothing dramatic, just accuracy again. Enough to sharpen understanding without editorializing. Later that evening, the observer visited one last time. Your translations accelerated things, he said. Good or bad? Effective. He didn't elaborate. Before leaving, he added something unexpected. Your family won't be monitored as closely now. Not reassurance. Not apology. Just information. And sure enough, over the next few days, the cars outside became less consistent. Checks eased. The invisible pressure receded slightly, not gone, just repositioned. Because once an international system engages, local pressure often redistributes rather than disappears. The thief himself remained unseen. No arrest announcement. No confirmed sighting. But his operational space had narrowed. That much was clear. And it happened not through force, not through confrontation. But through language refusing to blur. Which confirmed something I'd begun to suspect from the start. Sometimes the most decisive action isn't stopping someone. It's making sure they can't stay undefined. The attention faded slowly. Not gone, just redistributed. The cars outside my building stopped appearing daily. Road checks returned to predictable schedules. Conversations at the translation center shifted back toward routine incidents instead of layered ones. The system had absorbed the disruption and recalibrated, the way it always does when something crosses from local concern into international awareness. That's when silence becomes different. Before, silence had been protective, shielding a narrative someone wanted to keep contained. Now it felt procedural. Files moving through channels I'd never see. Agencies aligning language across borders. Quiet coordination that doesn't need witnesses. Interpol never contacted me directly again after that clarification request. No follow-up interviews. No official thank you. That absence told me the documentation was sufficient. They'd moved past translation into operational assessment. And once that happens, translators step out of frame. The official at the center grew almost cordial again. Professional respect replaces pressure once it's clear you won't bend easily. He stopped suggesting alternative wording. Stopped hinting at preferred phrasing. We worked side by side like any two specialists who understand each other's constraints even when they don't share priorities. One afternoon he said something I didn't expect. "You made this harder," he admitted. "For who?" "For everyone who prefers control." He didn't sound resentful. Just factual. "Was it necessary?" I asked. A long pause. "Yes." That was as close to validation as I'd get from him. At home, life stabilized in subtle ways. My wife noticed it first. Fewer unfamiliar vehicles. Packages arriving unopened. Even the ambient tension, the sense of being observed indirectly, eased enough that normal routines felt normal again instead of provisional. Still, we both understood stability isn't permanence. It's just the absence of immediate adjustment. News reports began mentioning increased international cooperation against financial and logistical theft networks. No names. No specifics. But the language matched patterns from the Interpol advisory I'd seen. The thief hadn't been caught. But his operational space was shrinking. That's often more consequential than an arrest. Professionals who rely on ambiguity lose leverage when clarity spreads. Movement becomes riskier. Allies grow cautious. Safe jurisdictions thin out. Language had done its work. Quietly. Without confrontation. One evening, reviewing archived transcripts, I noticed something small. The early softened versions, the ones local authorities preferred, were gradually being replaced in the system with the accurate translations. Not publicly announced. Not highlighted. Just corrected. That's how institutional memory adjusts once external oversight becomes consistent. No dramatic admission. Just incremental alignment. I asked the official about it the next day. "Consistency matters," he said simply. That was all. No apology for earlier pressure. No acknowledgement of disagreement. Just acceptance that accuracy had become the safer position. The observer never returned. Which likely meant his role had ended, or moved elsewhere. Either way, the absence felt deliberate rather than accidental. The most wanted thief in the world remained unseen. Interpol alerts stayed active. Reports suggested ongoing monitoring but no confirmed capture. Ambiguity hadn't vanished completely. It rarely does. But it had narrowed enough that silence no longer protected him the way it once had. And that, I realized, was the real outcome of everything that happened. Not exposure. Not victory. Just a system slightly less willing to pretend it didn't see. Life didn't return to normal. It rarely does after something brushes against international attention. Instead, it settled into a version of normal that accounted for what had happened without discussing it constantly. Conversations became simpler. Fewer careful pauses. Fewer indirect references. The tension didn't disappear, it redistributed into background awareness. That's the quiet aftermath most people never see. At the translation center, assignments shifted subtly. Less politically sensitive material. More routine documentation. Either trust had increased or risk tolerance had decreased. Possibly both. Accuracy, once proven consistent, often leads institutions to remove you from situations where ambiguity is preferred. Which suited me. I wasn't interested in becoming a permanent variable in someone else's narrative management. But the system kept adjusting. Occasionally, encrypted summaries circulated through professional networks, nothing classified, just analytical observations about cross-border theft patterns tightening. Financial channels closing. Movement routes becoming less predictable. Jurisdictions coordinating more efficiently. Again, no names. But the timing aligned. The most wanted thief still hadn't surfaced publicly. That absence itself carried meaning. High-profile criminals rely on operational rhythm. Disruption forces them to slow down, reconsider alliances, sometimes even pause entirely. Language had created friction. Not enough to capture him. Enough to complicate everything. My wife noticed another change first. The atmosphere feels lighter, she said one evening. She didn't mean emotionally. She meant operationally. Fewer subtle surveillance cues. Less background tension in everyday interactions. Even neighbors seemed less guarded, as if whatever quiet interest had existed around our building had dissipated. Probably reallocation, I said. Or closure, she suggested. Maybe. But closure in these situations is rarely explicit. More often, it's the absence of new questions. Agencies satisfied with trajectory rather than resolution. I received one final indirect confirmation weeks later. A colleague forwarded an internal professional bulletin, nothing classified, just best practice notes on translation integrity in multinational investigations. It referenced, without identifying details, a case where early linguistic precision prevented jurisdictional delay. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd get. No ceremony. No official thanks. Just institutional learning. The official at the center eventually moved to another post. No dramatic farewell. Just a handshake, professional courtesy, mutual understanding that our interaction had reshaped expectations on both sides. You were consistent, he said. You were pragmatic, I replied. Neither compliment. Neither criticism. Just accurate. The observer never contacted me again. The cars never returned. Interpol alerts remained active, but less urgent in tone. The case had transitioned from reactive to monitoring. Which often means professionals believe time is now working for them rather than against them. And that's the subtle power of clarity. It doesn't always resolve a situation. Sometimes it just changes who benefits from waiting. For the first time since the translation began, I felt something close to equilibrium. Not victory. Not closure. Just balance restored between what was said, what was recorded, and what systems were willing to acknowledge. That balance, fragile as it was, came from one simple decision. Refusing to let language make something smaller than it actually was. Months passed before I realized how much had actually shifted. Not externally, internally. Once you've seen how easily language can reshape reality, you stop hearing words the same way. Official statements sound different. News reports feel filtered even when they're technically accurate. Conversations about stability or clarity start revealing their subtext automatically. You don't lose trust. You just stop assuming neutrality. At the translation center, the workflow normalized fully. Routine municipal disputes. Tourism issues. Cross-border logistics questions. Nothing carrying the layered weight of that earlier incident. If the international investigation continued, and I knew it did, it had moved far beyond anything a local translator would touch. Which was exactly the point. Clarity pushes cases upward. And upward usually means quieter, not louder. My wife noticed something else. People treated us slightly differently. Not suspiciously. Not warmly either. More like quiet acknowledgement. The kind you give someone who handled a situation professionally without making noise about it. Respect in operational communities rarely arrives as praise. It arrives as absence of pressure. Even the occasional checks that still happened around town carried a different tone. Routine again, not contextual. No subtle signals aimed specifically at us. Still, one question lingered for both of us. "Do you think they ever got him?" she asked one evening. "The most wanted thief. Interpol alerts still active. Reports suggesting restricted movement. Financial channels closing. Associates becoming cautious. But no public arrest." "No," I said. "But I think they made his world smaller. That matters more than most people realize. Professionals who operate globally depend on frictionless movement. Jurisdictional gaps. Linguistic ambiguity. Institutional hesitation. Remove enough of those variables, and even the most skilled operator spends more time managing risk than exploiting opportunity. That's often how pursuit works at that level. Not dramatic capture. Gradual containment. I revisited the original transcripts once more, months after everything settled. Not out of concern, out of curiosity. I wanted to see whether the language still held the same weight. It did. Precision had aged well. No need for revisions. No embarrassing overstatements. No softened phrases that suddenly looked naive. Just accurate documentation of what witnesses believed they saw. That's all translation ever really promises. Accuracy, not certainty. Before closing the archive, I noticed a small administrative update. Nothing operational. Just metadata adjustments reflecting international coordination. The kind of bureaucratic trail that confirms a case matured beyond local jurisdiction. Again, no names. No conclusions. Just progression. And that's when I understood the final layer of this entire experience. The goal hadn't been immediate resolution. It had been preventing misdirection. Because if early language had stayed softened, if names had remained omitted, if reports had framed the incident as purely local confusion, the thief would have gained months, maybe years, of operational freedom. Language hadn't caught him. But it had removed his best hiding place. Ambiguity. And once ambiguity shrinks, even silence starts working differently. I never saw the man. Not in person. Not in surveillance stills. Not even in confirmed operational briefings. For someone considered one of the most wanted thieves in the world, he remained remarkably absent, which, I eventually realized, was part of his professional design. Visibility creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. Professionals who survive at that level understand that staying undefined is often more valuable than staying active. And for a long time, systems allowed that. Until language stopped cooperating. The translation case faded gradually into institutional memory. No final meeting. No definitive closure. Just fewer references, then none at all. That's how multinational processes usually conclude when there's no dramatic endpoint, absorption instead of resolution. But absorption still changes things. The international bulletins that circulated quietly afterward showed patterns tightening. Financial tracking improved. Border alerts aligned more quickly. Terminology standardized across agencies. Nothing headline-worthy. Just incremental clarity. Clarity rarely excites anyone. But it makes operations harder for people who rely on confusion. My wife once asked whether I regretted getting involved. Not because of fear, she never framed it that way, but because involvement inevitably complicates life. Privacy shrinks. Predictability fades. Even routine days carry background awareness. No, I said. Because the alternative would have been worse. Knowing something important was being softened intentionally, and agreeing, even passively, to let that happen, leaves a different kind of weight. One that doesn't dissipate with time. At the translation center, new personnel eventually replaced the official who'd first recruited me. Procedures became more explicit. Original audio archived automatically alongside transcripts. Cross-check protocols strengthened. Not because of me specifically, but because institutions learn when friction exposes vulnerability. That's how systems evolve. Quietly. Gradually. Often without naming the catalyst. Occasionally, professional discussions still reference that case indirectly. Not operational details, just the principle that early linguistic precision prevents jurisdictional delay. It's become a training example more than an active investigation. Which is probably the best possible outcome. The thief himself remains officially uncaptured. Interpol alerts persist. Reports suggest continued monitoring, reduced operational scope, fewer confirmed activities. No dramatic finale. Just containment. And containment, at that level, is often enough. Because once someone loses ambiguity, they lose freedom. Movement slows. Options narrow. Trust from collaborators erodes. The world becomes smaller even without physical confinement. Language did that. Not force. Not confrontation. Precision. Sometimes I think about how easily the story could have gone differently. One softer verb. One omitted name. One transcript adjusted just enough to keep everything comfortably local. Months, maybe years, of additional invisibility. That's the quiet power of words most people never see. They don't just describe events. They define whether events expand or contract in significance. This story never produced a dramatic arrest. It didn't need to. Because the real outcome wasn't capture. It was clarity. And clarity, once established, doesn't disappear easily, even when the people who benefit from it remain unseen. This story wasn't about holding ground. It was about knowing when to leave. If you want more hidden chapters, like the video and subscribe. And when survival depends on timing, who do you trust to decide?